Today, I'm going to be sharing my story of how I became a supervisor in Stepford County Railway. Make sure to stick around to the end as I'll be giving you some tips that might help you out if you're thinking of applying to become a supervisor, which helped me get accepted on my first try. I became a senior guard at SCR as part of the first ever batch of SGD applications, but going back in time a little, around mid-2020, I decided to apply for both SGD and senior dispatcher. I actually ended up getting offered a place in both, but I decided to go down the senior guard route as I thought this would be a bit more exciting with the role being new. Now for those of you who are interested in what the process looks like after you pass the applications, I'll briefly outline what you can expect. Though I will say that I'm not sure how much I can actually reveal, so some of this might be a bit vague as I don't want to get myself into hot water. Please also remember that I became a supervisor back in 2020, so things may have changed since then, but hopefully this will give you a rough idea. After I passed the application, I became a trainee supervisor. This role is just in the Discord and doesn't give you any sort of supervisor powers, it just gives you access to some of the important channels in the Discord server. As part of being a trainee supervisor, you're taught all that you need, along with a relatively straightforward test at the end to make sure that you've learnt and understood what you need to. To be honest, with a bit of common sense, it's not difficult at all. When I applied, I was already a signaller, but I think if I remember correctly, at this point if you weren't, you could be taught how to signal as all supervisors have the signaller role unlocked. After I completed my training, which I don't seem to remember taking much more than a week, I was now a fully fledged supervisor. Now this was probably one of the biggest highlights of my SGD journey, as this is the point at which it feels like all the hard work you put into your application and the anticipation of waiting for the results really pays off. This is also the point at which you can host and co-host trainings, moderate the Discord server, access commands in-game, and all that sort of cool stuff. In terms of the supervisor experience itself, I would say it was good. Think of it as a 7 out of 10. You do have a quota for a number of trainings that you need to complete per month in order to keep the role, but when I was a supervisor, management was relatively flexible in the sense that they were quite understanding that everyone was a volunteer and had lives outside of SCR, so you could take leave. But I do seem to remember there being a limit on this, and the management has changed since I left, so I can't speak for how it is now. Many people are surprised by the fact that there's a quota for a volunteer role, but I guess it does make sense. They want to have people on the team who can commit enough time to the role for it to be worthwhile and for them to be able to keep up with the demand for training sessions. Speaking about trainings, this was both an upside and a downside to the role. In terms of upsides, you could pick when you wanted to do trainings, you could pick whether you wanted to host one, which was a bit more work, or co-host a session, and it was quite fun as you get to know your fellow supervisors quite well, so there was no shortage of laughs. But the big downside was that there was a bit of pressure from the quota, and how long trainings took did vary. If loads of people failed, things would go quicker, but if many people passed, it would take a bit longer. This meant that, especially if a training that you had to attend was in the middle of the day, it could interfere with your life in the real world quite a bit. You've got to remember that as a trainee, just because you might be in the server for say 20 minutes, all the supervisors stick around to the very end, which from memory was about an hour to an hour and a half for a guard training. If you're interested in seeing the behind the scenes of what an SCR training looks like, make sure to check out my video where I cover the behind the scenes of a guard training. There are also other things that you can get involved with as a supervisor. These included submitting reports for breaking the rules in game, so say that someone reported another player for dispatching with a red signal, as a supervisor, you'd file that report. You could also moderate the Discord server, which I personally tried to steer well clear of as the SCR general chat is not a very nice place to be most of the time. A personal favourite of mine though was answering SCR assistance tickets. A lot of the time, these wouldn't cause you any drama and were relatively straightforward. Talking about things I liked and disliked, let's now talk about the pros and cons of the role. I've touched on a few of these already, but the pros include meeting people that you make really good friends with after working with them for a while. I'm still in touch with a few of the supervisors I worked with back in 2020. Another thing is, as stupid as it might sound, it genuinely is a good opportunity to build some basic life skills. Now this only really applies if you're on the younger side, and I'm by no means saying that you should put that you are a senior guard at Stepford County Railway and list Charlie as a reference on your CV, but I found that the role did teach me to work with a variety of people and taught me a few things about how to write a good application, especially as I was on the younger side at the time. You also get quite a bit of experience in dealing with people who are sometimes upset or being intentionally difficult, which is also another good skill to have. In terms of downsides, I'd probably say the biggest downside is the quota, which is actually why I ended up resigning from the role. Again, I understand why it's there, and it's no issue if you've got a lot of spare time on your hands, but a lot of the SCR community is at the age where they have exams coming up, and honestly, having been in a similar position before, the last thing you want on your mind when you're already stressed is a training quota for a Roblox game. Now let's move on to how to apply. It's pretty simple. Essentially, you've got to be in the SCR Discord server, and once you're in, you've got to wait for the applications to open. These will be announced in the applications form channel. Then, you've got to meet the requirements for the specific role that you want to apply for. Usually, one of these is having a high enough rank already. So for example, if you're wanting to be a senior signaller, you'll have to be at least a signaller, guard for senior guard, and so on. Now let's talk about some tips on how to pass the applications. I would like to preface this by saying that this is all just my advice and things that have worked for me in the past. I've never been a manager at SCR, so I don't know exactly what they're looking for, but what I'm going to say should give you a good start and put you on the right track. My first piece of advice is to make sure that you give detailed answers. You've got to remember that the person reading your application form doesn't know you, and even if they do, they won't know whose application they're reading, as all applications are anonymised. This means that whoever is reading your application is forming an opinion of you based solely on what you've written, so you've got to make sure that you make a good impression. Another important tip is to not pad out your application with what us British people call waffle. A shorter answer that actually answers the question that they're asking you to a high standard is likely to score far better than an answer that's a page long that goes off on a tangent. Obviously, make sure you're detailed, but don't feel like you need to cram things in just for the sake of making your answers look longer. You should also try to think about what the application readers and managers are looking for in your answers. Try to put yourself in their shoes. Consider the attributes that would make a good supervisor. You'll be working as part of a team when doing trainings, moderating the game and Discord server, as well as interacting with the community. From this, you can deduce that they're probably looking for someone who's a good team player, treats others with respect and has integrity, is approachable and friendly. You can also use this advice for the questions where they ask you about how you'd act in certain scenarios. Try to think about what the best solution to the problem they're giving you is based on what you'd think would make a good supervisor. You also shouldn't be afraid of spending a bit of time thinking about your responses. You're not timed, so there's no point rushing your application. After all, there's no prizes for submitting your application first. Personally, I found that avoiding doing the entire thing at once, taking a break and having some time to think really helps. This leads me nicely on to my next point, which is to write your answers on something like a Google Doc as opposed to straight into the form. This might just be me, but for some reason, this makes writing long answers far easier. It also makes checking things like spelling and grammar a lot easier as, in my experience, I've found that they do look for strong written communication skills. After all, a lot of the role will revolve around typing, and you're trying to convince them why you're the best candidate. Writing out your answers in a Google Doc and then pasting them into the form also gives you a backup of your answers in the event that they were to disappear from the form, which is always handy. You should also not ask any other people for help and make sure to obey the guidelines on application anonymity. It's just not worth the risk of getting your application voided or getting blacklisted entirely. Also, please don't use AI to answer the questions for you, they will most likely be able to tell. Try to also have a good standing in the community. Applications are eventually de-anonymised from what I know, and having a good reputation will definitely not do you any harm. And my final tip is, as difficult as it might be, to not be disheartened if you don't pass the application's first try, especially if you're eager to do the role. Becoming a supervisor is competitive, and unfortunately the odds are against you. I asked an SCR developer about how many applications each department usually gets. After he spoke to the managers, he told me that there are usually, on average, 1,000 SDS applications, 800 to 1,000 SGD applications, and around 100 SSG applications per round. If we assume that they tend to accept around 10 people from each round of applications, that's around a 1 in 100 chance of passing for most departments. So especially if you're one of the younger players, many of the other people who will be applying will be older teenagers who are naturally at an advantage. But although you might not realise it now, even if you don't pass, it's all good practice as being able to write a good application is a good skill to have. And that brings us to the end of the video. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope that these tips can be helpful if you decide to apply to become a supervisor in SCR. If you have any of your own tips that you feel I've missed in this video, feel free to drop them down in a comment below. Aside from that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.